Hi, hello. Um, we'd like to welcome all of you here in the middle of the Feral Palace. We are broadcasting live from Krater. Krater is an abandoned construction site gradually taken over by feral ecosystems. So we are joined here today also by invasive plants, ancient chestnuts, bees, maybe tiger mosquitoes. Are they here yet?
Eventually, they will be
Fungi.
here for sure.
But the community of creatives, microbiologists, permaculture workers, eco-social designers, creative thinkers, and many, many others. Today, with me here is Gaja Mežnarić, Osole, a driving force behind NGO Trajna and this place Krater. I'm Danica, architect interested in anomalies and the spaces and species which are not really aligned with general narratives. Together, we decided to curate the Feral Palace program, and we recognized that Krater, although full of life, is somehow invisible, or when seen by administrative documents, local press, or wider public, is seen as dangerous, troublesome, or empty space. We recognized consequentially the need to organize this collective learning experience to open novel perspectives of seeing and valorizing untamed urban territories. This whole program lasts till June and it's divided in two parts. First part is this series of talks in which we are joined by Klaas, Debra, and Rok. And the second part is about the design challenge. Our dear guest this afternoon is Klaas Kuitenbrouwer, a senior lecturer at the Het Nieuwe Instituut and an inventor of the concept of Zoöp, which was inspired by the idea of granting legal status to natural sites, giving them the same rights as a human being. So we hope that actually the Feral Palace talks will introduce concepts, vocabulary, and practices to think multi-species coexistence in contemporary cities. Now I will pass the word to Gaia so she can explain further what this incredible place is and what is awaiting for us till June.
Thank you, Danica, for your lovely introduction. Yes, and as Danica already mentioned, I'm a designer and co-producer of Creative Laboratory Krater, which sits in this rewilded construction pit in Ljubljana. Let me speak shortly about our leading intention to frame the Feral Palace program. In recent years, me and my colleagues on Krater developed a close relationship with multi-species life, which we found out regenerates and this disturbed ecosystem and enables our community to thrive, even in times when cultivating joy seems harder than usual. Through Krater, we're actively engaging with designing a world-making project which produces matter that matters. Even though our site-specific mobile production stations, fiber workshop standing on the opposite side of me, a wood workshop behind me, and a micro design lab, enable us to learn what it means to work and live with urban nature, Krater is far from being resilient. In fact, just the opposite is coming true. Its multi-species community is planned to be replaced with a 12-story building to host the future Palace of Justice. The development plans for the Palace of Justice came along just on time. They build momentum to raise the key question of our current investigation. Is there enough room in this notion of justice to include the rights of non-humans as well? How and with whom should we design the Palace of Justice for the 21st century and beyond? To navigate the period of sixth mass extinction and unpredictable climate changes, the Feral Palace program introduces a set of pioneering ideas and design methodologies to shift spatial planning towards design for multi-species justice. We're using this moment to officially launch the Feral Palace Open Call and invite designers, architects, and creative landscape architects to rethink the notion of the Palace of Justice with us. To apply to our multi-species design challenge, we ask creatives to join forces with ecologists, lawyers, environmental social scientists, and others, and design their creative proposals. Successful applicants will have the opportunity to work with 5 translocal experts from the field of multi-species urbanism, and become the first practitioners to highlight the spatial rights of multispecies communities in Slovenia. Furthermore, selected projects will be presented in co-production program with Center of Creativity and exhibited under the satellite program of Ljubljana's Biennial of Design Bio 27 called Super Vernaculars, Design for a Regenerative Future. If you're interested in applying, please find the link to the open call in the chat box below or visit our website krater.si. And please share the news also with other creatives you may know who might be interested to join the open call or the design challenge with us. So we are supported, our program is supported with a series of 3 public talks set to expose new perspectives on cohabitation, also with a wider audience. Today, as Danica previously mentioned, we're hosting Klaas Kuitenbrouwer, who will introduce us to the practice of Zoönomy. And then on 6th of April, Debra Solomon will speak about multispecies urbanism and the public space. And lastly, on April 19th, Rok Kranjc will theorize how to govern more than human transformations. And our first talk with Klaas is just a minute away. I would like to introduce Klaas shortly and then pass the word to him. So we have met with Klaas while attending a Zoöp curriculum program organized by him and his colleagues in spring 2021. And as we felt incredibly drawn to apply his innovative methodologies and spread them in our local contexts, we invited him to speak about the concept of Zoöp, its way of working, and discuss some specificities of the emerging proto-Zoöp Krater. Klaas is a teacher at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy and the driving force behind the Zoöp movement, which he develops at Het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. A consistent element in his work is the intersection of different knowledge practices, technological, artistic, legal, organizational, scientific, and more than human. In recent years, he curated, among other programs, Garden of Machines, Gardening Mars, the Neuhaus Temporary Academy for More Than Human Knowledge, and finally, in 2029, he initiated the Zoöp project. In his talk, Klaas will explain how you can become a Zoöp organization by learning how to collaborate with non-human life and how to transform your organization's way of working to develop a regenerative economy or human ecosystem that sustains bodies of any kind. Here we go. Klaas, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. We're really looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Fantastic to be part of the Feral Palace talks, and fantastic also to be able to kick off this beautiful program, beautiful design challenge for designing a feral palace, designing a palace for multi-species justice. Can you switch on my slides as well? Thank you. Yeah. So my name is Klaas Kuitenbrouwer. That was pretty spot on, the way you pronounced that. Thank you very much. It's not easy for non-Dutch people to catch this ui precisely, but you did a remarkable job. My main job is to be a researcher at Het Nieuwe Instituut, which is, I'm part of a team that kind of researches basically the content of our programs and projects. Next to that, I'm a teacher indeed at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy. It's an art academy in Amsterdam. And which is the reason I'm here, in 2019, together with a group of ecologists, biologists, farmers, entrepreneurs, lawyers, philosophers, designers, artists, I initiated the Zoöp project. That's what I'm going to speak about now. Zoöp is short for Zooperation. And obviously that contains 2 other words. It's cooperation with the Zoe, basically the Greek word for life in its kind of metaphysical capacity. The living sphere, not so much a life, not a bios, but actually life in general. So Zooperation is collaboration with life. A Zooperation is actually a new organizational entity. It's basically can be adopted by all different kinds of organizations, and as such it would form the centerpiece of the Zoöp movement, which in a way already starts, because the model is kind of practiced by several organizations already, but the moment of establishing the first actual Zoöp is still a couple of weeks away. I'll tell you more about that later. And the Zoöp model forms, the Zoöp organizational entity forms the anchor point for the practice of Zoönomy. Why? Well, it's a response to the near fatal historical mistake that us people from Western modernity have made. Actually, the historical mistake is much older, but we kind of mobilized it and made it the anchor point for all our cultural, organizational, economic, and technological practice, which turned it into this massive kind of lethal phenomenon. And the thing I'm talking about is this somehow the conception and also implementation of a split between nature and culture, nature being the world of the non-humans and culture being the world of humans. So Zoöp is an attempt to deal with this split at the fundamental level, at its basic manifestation. Zooperation is an alternative. So the Zoöp legal entity, the Zoöp organizational model, is an attempt to make a beginning, you could say, with the work of repair. So a Zoöp, once it's established, creates a conceptual material space in which an alternative than this split between nature and culture can take hold, can be developed, can be grown. And this is also an alternative for the capitalist logic that capitalizes literally on this split between nature and culture. And the logic that then takes hold, this logic of Zooperation, Zooperation you can call it, is the organizational model. And the world it brings forth is a world that is a system, you might call it, or a worldview as well, and a network of exchange that I refer to with the word Zoönomy. So as such, it's Zoöp is actually quite, it's deeply pragmatic. It's a practical answer to a question that has metaphysical dimensions. And the metaphysical dimensions are fantastically put together in this phrase, which I find extremely captivating by, this is Mark Fisher, but he actually quotes, who again, Frederick, sorry, I forgot the other name, but I got it from Mark Fisher, the cultural theorist. And he said this at one moment: it's easier to see the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Well, we're watching the end of the world, at least the end of the world as we know it. And Zoöp tries to be a seed for an alternative. It probably is too late to save the climate, but as we can't go back. But what we can do, and which is extremely important, is to start performing the work of repair as soon as we can. The work of repair is a phrase by Bruno Latour. The idea of Zoönomy that I'll go a little bit more into, you can also understand a little bit as along the lines of the term dark ecology, as Timothy Morton developed it. So an ecology that actually includes everything, an ecology that is not it's not thought of as organized along the split of nature and culture, but an ecology that is basically a network of everything, an exchange of everything that exists. Oh yeah, the other quote I already said. That's the famous phrase by Mark Fisher. So, what is Zoönomy? Depending on who you talk to, it's easiest explained as either regenerative economy. That's if you talk to people that are firmly rooted in the current system, and also economically rooted in the current system. And who is not. But you can also think of it, and this is handier if you talk with biologists or ecologists, sometimes with artists. You can also understand it as a human inclusive ecosystem. And this is actually, in the ideas of the people concerned with Zoöps, is the same. These things are equivalent. So The word regenerative economy I picked up from Kate Raworth, who wrote this fantastic book, The Donut Economy. It's also a very concise model. The book explains beautifully what is wrong, what is flawed about our economic thinking, and also how it should, what can we do with what we know in order to change it, in order to create the circumstances in which a regenerative economy can develop. And human inclusive ecosystem is a phrase that I picked up from Menno Schildhuizen, who is an urban ecologist who studies, that's also a beautiful book if you want to read it, Darwin Comes to Town. I highly recommend it. Darwin Comes to Town by Menno Schildhuizen, the name below here, in which he researches and tells a fantastic story about how other than human life adapts to the city and how it fills new niches, how it finds opportunity to live, how it's developed, how it evolves also in the city, and how new ecosystems come into being in urban landscapes. So Zoönomy is an economy as well as a regenerative economy as well as a human inclusive ecosystem. And these are equivalent. So an economy that does not only sustain human bodies, but actually all bodies, is the same thing as an ecosystem that does not only sustain non-human bodies, but also humans. So Zoönomy would be a network and process, and a process of exchange of matter and meaning that sustains all bodies in their existence, not just those of some humans. And why do we think we need another word than regenerative economy or human inclusive ecosystem? Well, actually, because I always need those two terms to explain what I mean. And Zoönomy, in a way, gets rid of the split between ecology and zoönomy, which is formally not a split. I mean, if you think it through, of course, they must be identical, but in practice, because our whole society is built on the split between nature and culture, ecology covers economy of the non-humans, and economy covers the ecology of the humans. So we want to get rid of that split, so we had to find a new word, which became Zoönomy. So it's proposed as a speculative but aspired alternative for the capitalist version of economy. Some sources of inspiration. This is an image of Wanganui River. One of the earliest, at least known to me, the one I knew of earliest, a case of an implementation, a formal legal implementation of rights of nature. This is New Zealand. Te Urewera Forest, the second one, also in New Zealand, and Mount Taranaki. These were the cases that I kind of learned of first when I learned of right of nature. And there are three instances of collective more than human bodies that in New Zealand culture, in the culture of Maori, of various Maori peoples, the Iwi as they're known, they're actually the living ancestors of these various peoples. In the law, in the New Zealand law, which is descendant of the Anglo-Saxon system, they were not considered as people or as living bodies or as subjects, but as basically as objects. So in a way, this legal innovation acknowledged, for the first time, acknowledged the fact that these bodies have to be taken as humans in the law. So as such, they're a little bit of a hybrid between a cultural concept of the Maori and a legal concept of Anglo-Saxon law. And together they form this legal personhood for these formations, for these bodies. So in legal terms, they're now incorporated non-humans, which, if you write it like that, is identical to what a corporation is. Like a company is also an incorporated non-human, but a company, as we know it, in the latest instance, still relies on human bodies. Like in the end, there's somebody, a human person, responsible for the company, and their name is on the contract, and their name is registered in the Chamber of Commerce. This is not the case with in this kind of rights of nature implementation. They basically collective bodies of non-humans, which themselves are the last legal instance. So this is the new the legal innovation. Okay, this is a rather average image of the Dutch landscape. We're basically, that's where the Zoöp concept was developed. It's highly international in its potential application, but it's developed in the Netherlands. So in a way, in this kind of context. And most of the country, it's one of the most densest populated countries in the world. It's mostly a hollow land between the sea, river delta, and it's below sea level mostly, and it's consists of pieces of land next to highways and urban landscapes. There's not any place in the Netherlands that has not been turned over in the last 300 years. So what we understand as nature is actually largely also human-made. This is somehow this on some level is a paradox in the Netherlands, but at the same time it's completely accepted. The country is made by humans mostly. Half of the surface area of the Netherlands, well, not half, a little bit less. A lot of the surface area of the Netherlands is actually created. So it's not that the land is the ancestor of the humans, it's actually the other way around. There's also a famous Dutch saying that says this. So, and we don't have non-humans that have the cultural standing of living ancestors. And we also don't even have non-human bodies that have the cultural standing of a big mountain or a huge river. Not all, but a lot of our rivers basically start elsewhere in Europe. We're only at the delta, the very end point of several big rivers. The one non-human body that you might consider as a candidate for this kind of legal personhood that was granted to the mountain, the river, and the forest in New Zealand is the Waddenzee, a big tidal area in the north. It's also fully enclosed by the Dutch jurisdiction. It's within the borders, and it's a worldwide. It's also a UNESCO heritage site. It's beautiful, and it floods away every day twice. You can walk on the bottom twice a day. Then it floods back, and it's a place full of life. This is also the first instance of serious discussions in the Netherlands of whether this could be a thing for the Netherlands, to apply legal personhood for the Waddenzee. That's the discussion right now. In Dutch indigenous culture, as in that of Western modernity at large, non-humans are not considered to be subjects, but they're actually resources, objects, and there's certainly not known as ancestors. So this is the condition we found ourselves in, and that does not provide a very good starting point to start thinking about rights of nature. So we had to come up with something else. We had to come up with something that works in the absence of a culture that already, let's say, does non-human subjectivity, that already acknowledges kind of horizontal relations between humans and non-humans. So that's what we did with a group of lawyers. I want to give two by name, Vincent Koorstra and Ernestine Idenburg. Later, actually this is the biggest Dutch law firm. They have an active pro bono practice. Debra helped us out in the second phase of developing the model. But next to the lawyers, there were ecologists, artists, theorists, designers, etc. Together we set out to develop something that could work in the context of Western modernity. So a way to organize more legal standing for non-humans in the absence of a culture that already acknowledges their subjectivity. And this became the Zoöp model. From the legal perspective, several advantages to the Zoöp model in relation to rights of nature. As we know it from New Zealand, there are other practices which are actually potentially even more interesting than the way it was done in New Zealand. Maybe I get to talk about that a little bit later, or maybe there's a question about that. The Zoöp legal model format does not require legislative reform, which is a very slow and thorny process and has to go through all the phases of democratic decision making, as it should, but that also makes it slow, and it also makes it the subject of lobby work of various interest groups, which makes it extremely, as you know, slow and thorny, as I said. But the Zoöp model, by contrast, works with existing legal instruments of civil law. Also, it does not formally grant rights of personhood, for which this legislative reform would be necessary, but it works on a premise that non-humans actually already have these rights, and what is necessary is not so much codifying these rights and kind of writing them in the law as the first step. What is necessary is actually to develop a practice that acknowledges these rights and that focuses on the effect of what would be desired, of what's the desired outcome of such a law. Namely, as that you treat those non-human bodies with respect and on the basis of equality. So the Zoöp practice focuses on that, focuses on fostering a culture, a practice, a way of organizing that basically organizes zooperation, creating a horizontal relationship between human organizations and multi-species communities on the basis of equality. So how does it work? The general design of the model has three main goals. First, as I said, it strengthens the position of non-human life within human societies. It does so within bodies of existing organizations. I'll come to that a little bit later. Second goal is that it supports ecological regeneration or quality of life for multi-species communities. And to foster ecological regeneration is one way to practice zoönomy, to bring zoönomy into practice. And the third concern that went into design is that it should be adoptable by a wide variety of organizations. Basically, anything that is organized in any formal sense should be capable of adopting the Zoöp organization model. Because our ambition was not only to create an opportunity for a small, precise, niche kind of group of organizations, but basically to be open to as many organizations as is possible, to create change on a scale that's beyond the people that already are convinced. So now we'll get down to the nitty-gritty a little bit. Sorry for this green little square. How does an existing organization become a Zoöp? There's two ways to become a Zoöp. One is to start from the get-go, so to found yourself as a Zoöp. And that will happen actually. That's not the topic of my talk, but I'll focus more on how can an existing organization transform into a Zoöp. But the basic requirements for a Zoöp, either newly formed or transformed from an early organization, are of course identical. A Zoöp is a Zoöp. So a organization transforms into a Zoöp, first of all, by including in its policy body. So that could be the board, or it could be any other assembly within an organization that formalizes the policies, that kind of acts as the arena for decision making. To include in that body, that policy body, a so-called speaker for the living. And this is a human who has one task only, namely to act as the speculative and political organ for the non-human collectivities of the Zoöp. This is the task of the speaker for the living. So how does this work technically? This is the invention we made with the use of existing aspects of private law. Basically, the speaker occupies a board observer seat. And that is a model we derived from the shareholder logic. It's something that's adopted sometimes by investment companies that want to protect certain interests. And they install a board observer which has a say on certain matters, which are kind of agreed upon by the organization prior to the board meetings, actually prior to installing this person. And this exactly is the model that we adopted, but then translated not to financial interest, but actually to the speaker acts on behalf or represents and protects and fosters the voices and interests of other than human life within the decision-making processes of the organization that is Zoöp. So this speaker, how did we organize this? That this person actually has also a legitimacy to take on this role, and not only the capacity. Of course, there's a skill set involved, but there's also, let's say, how can you just suddenly decide that you become this, and that you have the right to speak on behalf of other than human life? This is where we made an invention. we set up the Zoönomic Foundation. We set this up, actually this is initiated 2 weeks ago, formally, at the office of Debra, the law firm that I mentioned earlier. And this Zoönomic Foundation has in its statutes only one goal. And that's this goal, that is the task of the Speaker for the Living, and that is to articulate and to represent the interests of non-human life within the operational sphere of Zoöps. So, the Speaker for the Living acts as a delegate of the Zoönomic Foundation. An organization turns a Zoöp by signing a contract with the Zoönomic Foundation that includes a representative with a specific task, namely the Speaker for the Living, in the policy body of the organization that thereby becomes a Zoöp, a Zooperation. From that moment on, the speaker has a say on a series of issues that are discussed prior to becoming a Zoöp, and these issues can be adapted every year. Every year you can add new topics on which the speaker has a say. From that moment on, the Speaker for the Living, has a say on these matters in the decision making of the organization. Here is a diagram that I'm not sure explains things even more clear than I just said, but bear with me. So the Zoönomic Foundation is the body I just explained that has the task to delegate a Speaker for the Living into the executive board of a Zoöp. So this is a kind of enlargement of a Zooperation. These are all Zoöps. Behind all that, and as the kind of general support structure, is the Zoönomic Institute. You can think of that as me and the people I work with on a daily basis. That is the organization that helps organizations to become other organizations, to become Zoöps. And the first task is to find somebody to take on this role of the Speaker for the Living. So we collaborate to figure out somebody who can act as delegation for this body into a Zoöp. That's basically how it works. So what do you do then? Your basic goal, your basic reason for existence as an organization doesn't change. A school is still a school, a hotel is still a hotel, but you add a new goal, and that is to find out how to practice zoönomy. Or regenerative economy, or human inclusive ecology, or quality of life for a multi-species community that includes humans. These are all equivalents. So, the practice of zoönomy then is the effort to improve the health or ecological integrity of the collective body of a Zoöp. I really like this term, ecological integrity. It has two dimensions for me, probably more, but at least two that I find interesting. One is that the integral aspect talks of a multi-perspectives that have to be integrated into a shared ecological perspective. And the other one is that integrity also talks of ethics. So there's both this multi-dimensional, holistic kind of systemic approach that's covered by the word integrity as an ethical dimension. By becoming a Zoöp, this to improve the ecological integrity of your Zoöp on a yearly basis, step by step, decision by decision, becomes an added goal next to the goals that you already had as an organization. This may still sound a little bit abstract, so this was the 4 steps that I'm describing now were the actual meat, in a way, of the zoonomic curriculum that Gaja participated in last year. And this is what you actually do as a Zoöp. This is what you commit to. It's the zoonomic annual cycle. So the practical task of the Speaker for the Living is basically helping out the organization to go through this annual cycle and to make the decisions that help to improve the ecological integrity of the Zoöp. So 4 questions, basically simple questions that have potentially very complex answers. The first question is demarcating. Who are the bodies that together form the Zoöp? And it's clear already that the Zoöp is not only formed by bodies that are on the inside, but also by legal bodies from the outside, by rules and regulations, sometimes by the weather, by rivers that flow from certain spaces, by the sun that casts shadows or that gives light. A whole lot of bodies that together form the Zoöp. But the act of demarcating comes down to articulating also the legal, spatial, temporal, operational boundaries, ecological form of the Zoöp. Step one. So step two is answering the question, what is then the life worlds of these bodies? Like, what are the main signals, the main things these bodies perceive in their surrounding? If I can give an example, a legal body like the regulations of a municipality, I have a hard time perceiving their surrounding. They're actually not built to perceive anything. They're built to be enforced. The municipality may perceive things. They may perceive that the goal of this regulations is not met. But you have to go around. You have to go to a larger body to actually, let's say, make the legal body perceive things. For instance, the bookkeeping team of an organization is usually only responding to financial signals, and not, for instance, to chemical signals or smells. The bookkeeping has basically a horizon that consists of finance, but a tree or an insect or a bird, that is also a body, a non-human body that can be participating in the Zoöp, has a completely different life world that consists of very different dimensions that are not at all overlapping with the life worlds of the bookkeeping body or of that of the regulating bodies from elsewhere. So this gives you a kind of overview on how the different bodies in a Zoöp are able or are not able to perceive each other. Third question then is actually kind of diagnosis. So we call it characterizing. The process of basically diagnosing the current state of ecological integrity, which comes down to the question, like, how do these bodies support each other? Do they help each other in their quality of life, or are they obstructing each other, or maybe ignoring each other? So if you have this answered in the first year that you're a Zoöp, you've tried to answer these questions. There's, as you probably will see, these answers you're never really finished. There's always more details that you could add, but you have to start somewhere. And by answering these questions, you get as we found, a pretty interesting working map of the relational fabric of your Zoöp. So based on the answers to questions 1, 2, and 3, you get a whole list of potential. First thing that happens is that you formulate your regenerative goals. You say, well, I would like to, if certain bodies of my Zoöp would be able to perceive each other in ways they're not now capable. And secondly, I would like to, I don't know, for instance, improve the soil quality, or I would like to change the regulations that apply to the maintenance of the public space that is part of my Zoöp, or I would like to change the facades of a building so it becomes possible for birds to nest there, or I would like to break open contracts with a certain supplier because that supplier actually also makes money by selling or if, for instance, it spills toxic waste in a canal and is not willing to stop with that. So then we should no longer be, let's say, partly responsible for that body's operation. So we have to cut the contract. Giving you a couple of examples of the decisions that might come up by answering the questions, or the possible decisions that might come up by answering the questions to 1, 2, and 3. So basically, as a result of these questions, you formulate your regenerative goals, and this gives you the basis for the last and final step of the annual cycle: intervening, deciding and actually implementing transformations in your operation as a Zoöp. So actually deciding on how to improve the soil quality, or actually deciding to change the facade, or actually deciding to start a campaign, to start a regulation, to transform the regulations of a municipality. All these things are possible. And then you implement them, and then you monitor them and give public account of these interventions. Okay, so over to Krater. how would doing a Zoöp, doing Zoönomy, apply to Krater? Of course, I'm not a specialist, but I was given some information, kind of the results of a first attempt at doing a baseline assessment for Krater. So I'll go through that a little bit and talk about how, what possible choices are there then for Krater as we know it, and arrive to where we are, and hopefully giving you some entry points to answer or to creatively deal with the challenge of developing a feral palace, or a palace of multi-species justice. So this is was part of the introduction. It's an abandoned construction site. In terms of ecosystems, it's typically a pioneering ecosystem. It's the kind of plants that come to wild size first. Japanese knotweed is a hard one. It's a hard one to get rid of. It's actually, it's edible, so you can cook with it, but it's very hard to completely get rid of. But there are also various animals, fungi. At this moment, 79 species of plants have been identified. Probably there are a lot more. This is, let's say, a description of in the traditional ecological terms. Now, what happens if you apply the zoonomic method? So you ask these questions: what bodies form the Zoöp? I'll go through a list. I won't read them all. I'll just give you a general idea. And these are all the bodies, human bodies, that act as participate in Zoöp, that are most often nameable also, and that have a particular role to play within, as individuals also, within Krater. Architect, passers-by, people that walk their dogs, temporary users, visitors, an intern, particular people with particular skill sets, a microbiologist, product designers, etc. Organizational bodies. These are basically usually human bodies, but they're arrangements, they're assemblages that also include machines and usually computers, sometimes cars or buildings and other things. Organizational bodies that have an organizational presence, have an organizational capacity in Krater. There's a couple of words I'm not sure how to pronounce. Prostorods, maybe. Trajna, of course. The Slovenian Permaculture Association that's actually participating in Krater. Some of these bodies have an external organizational influence, and some are, the other ones, the bottom ones, are all parts of Krater, part of the Krater community itself. Atelier Luma in France, that have also worked with another Zoöp context, for instance. Legal bodies, these are a little bit more, usually they're bodies of rules with the bodies that implement these rules. So there's a contract which has a specific way of functioning, setting spatial and temporal boundaries around the current reality of Krater. There's the municipality of the city of Ljubljana. I'm actually not sure what this whole abbreviation stands for, but it's definitely part of the city of Ljubljana. And there's a particular project contract. All these texts are also, let's say, formulated by bodies that, if you want to change those texts, you would have to kind of entry them. You have to have they don't have a direct capacity of perception, but they're through their back door. You can sometimes change these. Sometimes project contracts can be transformed, but usually this is a very complex and slow process. It's not always a reality, a real a practical reality to develop this on a short notice. Other than human bodies, and here's a lot of stuff that has already been mentioned. That was also the part of the introduction. On the first slide of this Krater chapter in the presentation. Certain invasive plants, which are invasive in the sense that they are not always conducive to quality of life for other plants. Sometimes they are, but they tend to take over. A whole lot of other, how do you call these again? rodents, so is the word, rats and mice, St. John's wort, that's this midsummer plant, daisies, tiger mosquitoes, a lot of other than human living bodies that together make up the zoop. Various compost. There's not a lot of lists of soil life here, but of course there are earthworms, there are probably insects and butterflies and nematodes and microbes and mycelia, a whole lot of bodies that live underground that also collaborate with the above ground plant species. Oh, sorry, I didn't have, of course. There was another slide. These are all human artifacts, of course, also non-human bodies, but not so much non-human living bodies, so I grouped them separately. A tree nursery, a beehive, a shelter for invasive goldfish, production spaces, and that all these bodies also have a certain presence and a certain agency within the fabric of Zoöp, protozoop Krater. Most biomass, soil and gravel, had large external weather forces like the wind, the sun and the rain. A fence, of course, very important in that it filters bodies that can trespass, that can come through and not. Usually fences are meant to either keep out humans or non-humans of particular sizes, but are generally open to seeds and non-human bodies of smaller sizes. So their fences are always filters. Of course, there's traffic and the fumes of traffic that come from nearby streets. So, this was a list of bodies that together form the Zoöp. So, if you would perform the next stage of doing the baseline assessment of Krater, you would ask yourself and have to answer the question of what is the life worlds of these different bodies. And then the one that seemed to be most kind of dominant in the immediate future of Krater seem to be the life worlds of the organizational bodies and the legal bodies, because these are the ones that at this moment have the largest agency on the near future. The non-human living bodies are finding a way to live together. The organizational bodies of the community of Krater are in support and in a lot of kinds of conversation with those non-human bodies. But there are external organizational bodies and legal bodies that have articulated plans for the Krater site and have called for the design of the Palace of Justice. A design has been chosen, a plan is made, and a plan is made to execute this design within the coming years. The actual date is already set, but usually this date is postponed, but it's probably not going to be cancelled. This is the reality. This is the reality of Krater as it is now. So the question is, for the ecological intricately of Krater as it is, and now I'm actually doing this diagnosis thing, the third question. The question is it possible to register with those organizational bodies and legal bodies in such a way that the living non-human bodies and the living community of Krater can maintain or even increase its ecological integrity? At this moment, it seems to be a hard question to answer, but I think this exact design challenge as it is formulated for this call is probably exactly the way these goals are met in the most kind of potentially productive combination. So, if you would have to formulate, based on the current diagnosis and the bodies and the life worlds of those bodies, if you would have to formulate the regenerative goals for Krater, what could they be? And knowing that the most urgent ones are the ones that deal with this plan of redeveloping the site. So what would have to happen is exactly the premise of this call. The design of the Palace of Justice would have to be informed with perspectives that make the voices of other than humans inclusive to this design. So basically, in terms of a Zoöp terminology, it would be the life world of the Ministry of Justice that is now focused on the legal behavior of humans and human organizations has to be expanded. So the task of this design challenge, if you focus it on the Ministry of Justice, is to modify its life world. And this is an answer to the question 2. So basically by coming up with designs that include the legal perspective from the legal perspectives for non-human living bodies. But how to do that? So various interventions then have to be developed that support this regenerative goal. So that's the workshop. That's also the coaching of the designers, the participant designers of this call. Potentially, this would be fantastic if this is possible. It's hard to say whether this is possible at all, but let's imagine. Let's not count it out for now. Potentially, the result of this call is that some intervention is possible in the development plans for these pillars of multi-species justice. Maybe not so much in the actual architectural drawings, but maybe in the way the whole project is set up. What if the idea of multi-species justice also becomes part of the legal horizon of the Ministry of Justice? How can this be done through this workshop and through this design challenge? What would be necessary for that? And maybe a good way to acknowledge it or to kind of develop this speculative future is how would it look? And not so much only visually, but also in terms of regulations. The other set of potential regenerative goals follow the logic of what happens to the Krater community. So at this moment, the Krater community consists of the human organizations and the non-human communities of the site. But what if these two get separated? What if this building that is now is drawn and will be constructed in the future? What if this building forces, and this is likely, the human communities of Krater to move elsewhere? This also may provoke a regenerative goal and maybe provoke interventions to support this regenerative goal. So then that question, that regenerative goal could be, how can the Krater community as it is, now I'm talking of the human organizational bodies that now make up the Krater community, how can that community be grown? And how can it start descendants, offspring, in other sites in Ljubljana or in Slovenia or elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world? And start sites that could be Zoöps in Ljubljana and Slovenia. These would be my kind of suggestions to follow, that follow from the application. Of course, this is rough. It actually needs a lot more detail and a lot more work. But for the sake of this presentation, these would be the kind of suggestions that would follow from applying the practice of Zoönomy, the zoonomic annual cycle, to the current reality of the Krater community. So, to close off, the practice of Zoönomy is a long game. And this is obvious, I think, but I just want to restate it. Changes in the fabric of a Zoöp make it necessary to read the fabric again, which may provoke may lead to observations of new possible interventions. Basically, a Zoöp is never done. A Zoöp always strives for greater ecological integrity, if not for the local surrounding, then for its wider operational sphere. The final goal of Zoöps together, Zoöps on their own strive for greater ecological integrity. Zoöps together strive for the emergence, the fostering of a regenerative economy or human inclusive ecosystems. Sorry, this is exactly what I said. So every year, Zoöps strive to improve their ecological integrity and share knowledge about their findings. And in this way, Zoöps together can learn how to foster a regenerative economy. This I want to skip. This is my very final slide. I want to tell you a little bit on where we are. And this is also, I think I announced this at the very beginning. So we developed the certification logic for a Zoöp, the basic rules for an organization to be able to call itself a Zoöp, the organizational model, a way to practice it, how to build it into smaller and larger organizations. We wrote a manifesto. This is the text you publish. It's a half a page, actually 20 rules, more or less, 20 lines. The text you publish when you become a Zoöp, kind of pledge, you could call it. This is a list. The list goes on below the slide, actually, of the current organizations that call themselves proto-Zoöp, that have publicly committed to become a Zoöp. And it pleases me very much to be able to say that the first actual Zoöp in the world will be Het Nieuwe Instituut. This is the place I work now, but only as an employee. I will at some point stop working at Het Nieuwe Instituut and become part of the team of the Zoönomic Institute that helps other organizations to become Zoöps. But Zoöp Het Nieuwe Instituut will be started at 22nd April this year, so on Earth Day. This marks the moment where, from this moment on, from 22nd April 4th, we will be able to start more actual Zoöps, first in the Netherlands this year, and next year also in other countries in Europe and in the world. That's me for now. I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'm very interested in hearing your potential questions. And I think this is time also to open the mic again to Gaja and Trajna. Thank you very much.
Klaas, thanks for a great talk. It was really, really nice to see an overview of the context that you give to Krater, because this is what I was talking about at the beginning, that these all things that you presented are not visible when we are analyzing and going through the usual like architectural drawings of some site. So I think you really widened the perspective with that, and thank you for this one. Now we're opening the question sections for our guests. So if you have any questions for Klaas, please add them to the comments, YouTube and Facebook. So Gaja, maybe you can write. We already received one question from other Gaja.
So we received a question from our colleague Gaja, and as you were mentioning some living examples in New Zealand, she was wondering if there are some similar examples of human-like law that could be an equivalent in Europe as well. Do you know of, or are you aware of any?
Yeah. Rights of nature are implemented in over 500 cases by now, spread over the world, but nearly exclusively in places where indigenous cultures are still alive, that basically never went through this, the culture that never went through this phase of mass modernity and performing this split of nature and culture. But it's done in very different ways. So in Ecuador, for instance, rights of nature are implemented in the constitution, which I think is a very interesting way of doing it. In Europe, at this moment, no actual rights of nature have been implemented, but Italy, a month ago, has included, and this is a European first, has included in its constitution the obligation for all legal bodies, so all humans and organizations, to protect the environment. And this is not technically rights of nature, but it does kind of create a new precedent. And this is the first time this happened in Europe. There are various initiatives in Europe for implementing rights of nature, but it's, as I hope I explained, it's a little bit different. You cannot just implement rights of nature within a culture that does not have the concepts that actually make it work. So these processes are quite complicated. But there's talk of a big lake in Spain. There's talk of the Waddenzee. There's talk of the river, the Maas, the Meuse River, to make this a legal person. Actually, worldwide, rivers are now the most bodies that have been granted legal personhood are rivers. I think this is like about half the cases of rights of nature concern rivers.
So maybe this one, I have one question which maybe can be in case that Krater becomes a legal body. So who is its legal representative? I think you already mentioned this in a speech, but this is this speaker who is recording all things, no? Because what is troubling me when you are like representing Krater or natural site, you're doing it from a human perspective. You cannot change this. Human-centered argumentation.
That's so. There's two sides. So Krater is not only non-humans. Krater is a community of humans and non-humans, and it will remain no matter how you call it. It will this will be the case. It actually needs its humans to be acknowledged. It needs the humans to acknowledge the non-humans. Without humans, it would be basically an abandoned construction site and nothing else in the eyes of most. So it needs you to be articulated as more than just that. That's the first. So, but then the Zoöp model, the Zoöp approach proposes to do this through giving a human body a specific task, namely to act on behalf this unique task that actually is not is not as strange as we tend to think it, or as people from Western modernity tend to think it. Worldwide Western modernity is an exception. It became, through a sad history of colonialism and ecological development, it became the worldwide standard, but culturally it's an exception. This idea of split between nature and culture was only developed here. It's not part of the cosmologies of North America, not part of the cosmologies of South America, not of Africa, not of New Zealand, not Australia, not Siberia. It's only done here, and it became the standard, but it's actually the exception. So this is a little bit of a, let's say, contextualization. Also, it is not, the first act is, of course, to assume kind of solidarity, that all bodies want safety, food, and a chance to proliferate, to procreate. This is not, a lot of the things that human bodies desire are quite similar to, between other humans and non-human bodies. The assumption that we have to, let's say, completely transform before we can understand the needs of other than human bodies is not necessary. I mean, it starts with, on a much more basic level, it starts with solidarity and empathy. And this is quite easy. This is not as hard as we tend to think it. And the fact that we tend to think that this is hard is the effect of the split of nature and culture, but it's not necessarily so. It's not, it's a relative easy shift to be able to make. So then on top of that, of course, there's a lot of special skill sets that make it handy, that make it, let's say, believable, and that make it kind of develop a kind of expertise in acting on behalf of other than humans. And that's to know them very well. And this is the kind of knowledge that biologists and ecologists develop. So for instance, for Het Nieuwe Instituut, that's the first actual Zoöp in the world. The person that will act as speaker for the living is Maaike van Stiphout. She's a landscape designer, she's an architect, nature inclusive architect. But actually her practice has consisted for the last 20 years already of looking at designs from the perspective of other than humans, to look at the building through the eyes of birds, to look at the soil through the eyes not only of the empty eyes of the infrastructure, but also actually of the living eyes of worms and plant roots, and to design with those perspectives in mind. And this is her daily practice. And that's not it's not very exotic, right? It's actually quite, if you practice it, it becomes completely obvious. That's maybe one thing I would like to add. I think this is our aim. Right now, Zoöp for some people sounds exotic and a little bit odd and a bit out of the mainstream logic. Our aim is to make it totally obvious and self-evident, and to make it the default and not the exception. This will take some steps, but as the weather on the North and South Pole is rather freakish, and not only that, the mainstream has lost its legitimacy. We have to take revolutionary steps, and once you do them, they turn out to be less strange than before you did them. And it turns out for Het Nieuwe Instituut, at the beginning it was strange, but already now, today I had a meeting with the board and with the speaker for the living to go through the practical steps. this was not a very awkward meeting. This is let's do this. What can we do from what does our garden need? What do the plants need? How do the facades look from the eyes of birds? A couple of points that came by in this session. It's not as strange as you think before you do it.
Yeah. At this point, I would maybe like, because we still have 27 people listening to us, to encourage our listeners to post a comment or a question. We know that it's a complex theme and the topic is quite new, but for sure there are some insights that you would like to share. Gaja, do you have a question?
I just received a question. I will try to read and hopefully it's clear. So it comes from a listener from the YouTube channel, and he wanted to ask, or she wanted to ask, as you said, Zoönomy is equal in meaning to many things such as regenerative economy, etc. I can't help to think that maybe there are many different terms and organizations working to implement these different but in equal terms. Is there a way to begin to unite these terms, other organizations, and all that energy into some way to begin to create a more critical mass around these ideas? Or is this your hope with the concept of Zoöp?
Exactly. We don't want to say, we don't want to be purist. So Zoöp is designed as something extremely practical. The 4 questions that you ask are basically, or the answers that you give are open to any organization can ask these questions and answer them. Any organization can set its own regenerative goals and find the interventions that foster this regenerative goal. So our basic attitude is and never or. So that's also why I keep including these terms like regenerative economy and human inclusive ecosystem. I don't want to necessarily fully replace those terms, but I do want to kind of lift the historical burden of regenerative economy, because it sounds like economy, and economy for a lot of people sounds like capitalism. And there we have to find an alternative way to talk about it. And so in a way, the word Zoönomy is the answer to a very practical goal. But if you don't need it, then you don't need to use it. But I do think it's handy sometimes to be able to use it, to be able to be particular about, but wait a minute, if we talk about the regenerative economy, what we actually mean is something that sustains all bodies and not just human bodies. And this is a radical thought for a lot of economists. Economy is supposed to eat away the living world, or it's not supposed to, but it does. And this is the assumption. And it shouldn't, of course. I mean, how can, this is an end game. Like, how can we go on like that? So we have to re-articulate this goal of, or this supposedly inevitable effect of economy. And for that, it can be handy to have other words to use instead of that of economy, to not get confused.
So maybe just this one thing, the terminology that we use is mostly legislative economy. I don't know and I have this question, what I as an architect, what designer has to do with it? What designer or an architect or a landscape architect? Maybe it's most obvious for landscape architects, but these are the people that we are addressing in the call. So how you can see these creative practices in connection with Zoöp, what they are doing, because we cannot be can we be representatives at the court, for example, what we are doing here?
I think my answer to that question is, I think your call is a perfect answer to how to do a Zoöp with Krater, to organize, to make sure that these multi-species perspectives become included in the legal perspectives of the country. I think this is, I think that's a fantastic regenerative goal for Krater to take. The other goal is but how to take care of the non-human bodies at Krater right now. The question is that compatible with the actual redesign of the site, the actual rebuilding of the site? I hope it would be, but this is, I cannot judge that from where I sit. So, but that would come down to how this site transformation is then taken up, how this process is designed. Will certain trees be moved away and then planted back, or will we build around the trees, or will the whole building be? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but this is another way to think about it. So that's the design of a process. And then the third potential, I didn't cover that in the talk, but and then the third potential answer, and I did cover that, is that but what of our community, which also has its human community, which also has its own regenerative goals, which could be transplanted to other sites. If the site, the physical site, and the non-human bodies of Krater as it is now are no longer part of the Krater community because they're erased by the new building, then, and this is also a regenerative goal. So yeah, and these are all design questions from where I sit. All organization is design. It's not only the design of non-human objects. All those processes, all those ideas, sentences, stories that lead to the physical implementations are part of the design.
I might have like another more practical question in terms, like I'm wondering if some of us that are listening, the audience that is listening to your talk and wants to engage with the Zoöperation immediately or tomorrow, like what would be the next steps for them? Would that be that they need to contact your Zoöp board, or like just firstly start with the 4 steps you proposed today? What would be?
As of now, so it is not yet possible to start Zoöps. The first one will be at Nieuwe Instituut, and we're nearly ready to actually do it. We will be in a month, and this is the date. So right now, what you can do is be a proto-Zoöp, like Krater. And it's exactly like you did. So you can understand your own work field, your own operation as something that is not only concerning humans, but actually touches upon the lives of a lot of other bodies, or non-human bodies. So I think it's indeed, as you say, the best way to start with would be to start with this baseline assessment. And then from that, you formulate the regenerative goal. And this can be, I don't know what it is, depends on where you are. But this would be at this moment, this would be the best start. And then if you're ready, when we're ready, please do get in touch, and then we'll take it from there. Yeah.
Perfect.
I also saw another question in the chat, which I think is interesting to answer. This is from the other Gaja as well. Are there examples? Do we have European examples of Zoöp nature? So if I can rephrase that, do we have European examples of human non-human collaborations? Yes, of course, we have a lot. Permaculture is a practice that and they're part of the Krater of the Krater community already. Permaculture is explicitly focused on collaboration. In the Netherlands, you now have a movement of agroecology. I think it's also a worldwide movement. It's the principles were formulated in Mali in 2015, but it's actually also a worldwide movement. It's basically be a farm that supports life. So not a farm that provides foods for humans, but also for non-humans. And that's also a fantastic example of a whole set of practices that fit entirely within the Zoöp approach. Nature inclusive architecture is another set of practices, but a little bit less, let's say, fully usually architecture also involves using concrete and other things, and not all the processes of architecture are, let's say, fully Zoöp compliant. But there's rapid improvement is being made there as well. Wood architecture is very interesting. Also takes off massively all around Europe, also in the Netherlands, but also in other places where wood structures replace concrete. Also, wood, of course, sinks CO2, where concrete leads to a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Yeah, there's a whole lot of mycelia products that have replaced products that were formerly used, all kinds of plating and wall covering, but also packaging material, all kinds of ways to use materials which actually can be support other life rather than create detrimental circumstances. All these things are happening, and I think it's a fantastic moment to engage with these kinds of practices as designer also, these kinds of materials and processes.
Perfect. We just received another question from Hannah, and she would like to know how would it be possible to move past the connotation to spirituality when it comes to terms like interspecies collaboration or more than human worlds.
It's very hard to kind of organize that. This is something that happens. Well, of course, this is part of a cultural transition, and let's say the inspiration that now happens. This is quite an interesting moment. This is one of the first moments that you see really kind of reversal in a cultural process, where Western modernity has always been the exporter of ideas that kind of dominated the cultural sphere over the world. Now these rights of nature are a kind of reversal. Now, for the first time, indigenous cultural concepts begin to inform the logic of Western modernity. This is in the law, and then of course also in this, at least from the perspective of Europe, in the periphery of the former colonial empires, from the perspective of indigenous peoples, of course, in the center where it matters, which is the place where they live and we don't live. We, as in white bodies from Europe. So that's a very this inspiration, I think, is fantastic. And yes, of course, this relates to the spiritual, but in a certain way, and here's a tricky bit, the idea of spirituality is kind of hampered by the same nature-culture split. And let's say in the Western tradition, the spiritual there's a vertical relation between the spiritual and the material. The god is the sky god, and the earth is the world of objects. And so part of the movement of a Zoöp, part of the transition of this vertical reality to a horizontal reality, is also to see that spirituality is not something that is higher or belongs to a vertical logic, but actually belongs to a horizontal logic, and where all matter is spiritual, a bit like, for instance, the Hindu and Buddhist and Shinto and also a lot of indigenous cultures do it, where all matter or actually, but there's Western tradition as well, like Spinoza and Whitehead to a certain extent. Of course, a lot of the post-human philosophers do this. Rok will talk about this in the third talk. Basically try to escape from this dualism, and that's the same dualism as between nature and culture. Culture is then the world of humans, of subjectivity, also of the potentiality of spirit, and the world of nature is that of objects, is of animals that don't have self-consciousness, that don't even have a soul, if you're Christian, that are not capable of evil because they can't make choices. They're basically advanced automatons. Humans are the only people that have responsibility because they can choose between good and evil. I don't have to kind of cover that whole subject matter, but this is something that kind of hampers our idea of spirituality. And so, yes, indeed, Zoöp is a way, you could say, of to deal with the whole world as kind of spiritual. But it's not a spirituality that belongs to the sky or to some other world. It's like the spirituality that belongs to matter. It's the spirituality that is the same as reality, and not the other. It's not an other world. It's this world. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
At least that's how this gets a little bit personal. This is how I think about it. And of course, everybody has to answer these questions themselves also. But I do think it's a hard one to cover from the perspective of where we are, because, well, like I explained, if spirituality is part of this dualism, then you cannot do it within Zoöp. Then you have to go find another angle. Yeah.
I think that was like a really nice closure to the whole session. So bringing spirituality to the matter sounds perfect.
Which is not part of the dualism.
Of course.
Exactly. It's the simplest way, I would say, is to to kind of get rid of these vertical realities. And somehow this dualism is always vertical. There's something on top, and this is the same thing with that organized our economy, that organized the whole colonial project, that organizes, basically everything that came out of the West. It also made science possible. It made a lot of things possible. It's not all bad necessarily, but the chickens are coming home to roost. It is a lot of it turned out to be a fatal historical mistake. And there's deep need for repair. And this implies indeed forming horizontal relationships that make all matter spiritual and all spiritual matter.
Perfect.
Yes, I think that we can conclude here because we didn't receive any more questions. So Klaas, really thank you for all of your insights and the beautiful talk.
Thank you.
And we will invite you all to join our open call, which is up in commentary section. You can find a link there, and actually Klaas will be a mentor. We will have sessions in May. So check it and apply. We will be happy to collaborate further. Then we continue on 6th of April with Debra Solomon speech, who will talk on multispecies urbanism and the public space. And on 19th of April, Rok Kranjc will talk about how to govern more than human transformations. We really hope to see you again here. And to continue this investigation of Krater. And maybe we received one more question. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you, Sasha. Yes.
Thank you.
To explore this
multi-species journey together.
Yes.
Maybe just one more thing to mention on the next talk. Besides the fact that Debra will be presenting her amazing work, we will also make a short introduction of Krater. So we will be preparing a short video for you. If you're interested to know a bit more about Krater, then will be the moment to join us as well. But I think, Danica mentioned everything, so we can just share a bit of view on the Krater. It's getting really slowly dark here,
and we are sorry for any technical problems. We really find it important to broadcast from Krater, so this is the reason why we were freezed for most of the time, but
hopefully not most. And we have a helicopter now,
another species joining
us to say goodbye.
Okay, say good then goodbye.
Thank you, Klaas, again, and hope to see you on 6th of April.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to meeting some of the designers that are hopefully watching now in the conversations on your design ideas. Very excited to be part of this again. So
then open call is open till 22nd of April. Go and check it. So
oh, fantastic! That's the day we become a Zoöp. So
way of communication.
To remember.
So till 6th of April. See you soon, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.